Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. The show, as most of you know, that brings you the uncompromising libertarian perspective on what's going on in the world. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel and is a longtime, hardcore, uncompromising libertarian. Richard, good to see you again.
It's great to be back with you and our viewers and listeners in the new year.
Yeah, I thought we'd discuss a couple of things in the news this week. One is the government shutdown circus that we all got treated to, thanks to President Trump and the Congress. And then the second thing is Trump's imposition of tariffs on washing machines and solar panels that targets primarily South Korea and China. So let's start out with the shutdown circus. You did an article on it that we published on our website at fff.org, and I did a blog on it. Why don't you go first and give me your take on the whole shutdown circus, and I'll give you my take.
Well, of course, the shutdown was not a shutdown, even though it was over a weekend. And this has been the pattern with a variety of these shutdowns that have been for a few days, or in one case for about 3 weeks, because basically the government doesn't shut down. The Congress and the presidents have always decided that there are certain essential functions of the government. Military, the Defense Department, the national security agencies, they keep operating and functioning. Soldiers in faraway places, surveillance agencies still looking into our various forms of communication. Then there are the entitlement programs. Social Security, Medicare, and so on. These keep functioning with staff, and the money keeps flowing out. And then finally, there's a whole variety of other related activities, such as the Congress itself, the certain departments and bureaus and agencies that undertake government regulation, the FDA, and so on, the Food and Drug Administration. These keep regulating, intruding, and dictating commands and restrictions on how people function in various sets of the market arena. So in fact, this is basically just smoke and mirrors where politicians can play sort of confrontation games with each other that, oh, if you don't do this, we won't do that. We won't sign off on this spending allowance if you don't do this. This has been followed. And it's all a way for politicians to go back to their bases, as it's phrased, or in their constituency, and say, well, I supported this on principle, or I opposed this on principle, where in fact nothing really changes, because the real issues at stake, not just what government is spending on and the amount, but the more fundamental issue, well, why is government spending at all in these avenues within a debate over what is the function, purpose, and limit of government? Are these spendings for the protection of the individual citizens' peaceful and honest rights to their life, liberty, and property? Or are these debates over, well, if you don't approve this spending package for my constituents of special interest groups, we won't go along with raising taxes here or approving a tax bill there to keep the flow of money going. So it's basically just a game of politicians jockeying for position with their special interest groups and trying to use leverage to get their bag of financial goodies approved by the other side. So it was just nothing. And it didn't even last into a week. I mean, the weekend, most government agencies are shut down anyway in terms of people are home for the weekend. There was the threat that it would continue on Monday. But unlike Obama, who during the 2013 shutdown for a period of time, wanted to make Americans realize that this was serious. And he shut down the national parks and the national monuments. And an America knew that we were at a crisis point because you couldn't visit the Statue of Liberty or take the elevator to the top of the Washington Monument. Oh, the horror. Now, the Trump administration, trying to ease people's pains, said that if it went on into the week, the many national parks would remain open, but we have to abide by the law, and therefore there would not be garbage pickup. Oh, the aroma in the picnic areas in the national park. So this was all a joke for jockeying over this issue of is a wall going to be built? Are these dreamers going to be allowed to stay in the United States, and so on and so forth? It's all political shenanigans with no substance.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. That I predicted before the shutdown that there would be no shutdown, and then that prediction failed to come true. But then I immediately made a new prediction that the shutdown wouldn't last very long, and that prediction came out to be true. And my argument is that the reason they can't afford a shutdown to last very long is because people would figure out that nothing happens. I mean, nothing serious happens. The United States doesn't fall into the ocean. The country's not taken over by the communists or the terrorists or the illegal aliens or the drug dealers. I mean, look, we libertarians have long argued in favor of, many of us, limited government. Okay, but what's our definition of limited government? Well, as you point out, it's a government that's intended to protect life, liberty, and property. At the federal level, that primarily means protecting the nation from an invasion, because most criminal justice can be handled at the state level. Even crimes that cross state lines can be handled through extradition between the states, cooperation between the states. There's really very little reason for the federal government to be involved in law enforcement that the states can't handle themselves. So when we talk about limited government, our definition is dismantle the entire welfare state apparatus that's attached to the government that came into existence primarily in the 1930s. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, Obamacare, all the FDA, SEC, the whole thing, just dismantle it, all the regulatory apparatus. And then dismantle the whole national security state apparatus, the Pentagon, the foreign military bases, well, most of the domestic military bases, the CIA, the NSA, all the Cold War junk. Well, and our argument is America, this would be fantastic. This is what a free society would be all about. The dismantling of both the welfare state and the warfare state functions of the federal government. Leave the federal government intact with just very limited functions. And they would be fantastic in terms of prosperity. You'd have no more income tax because you don't have anything to fund anymore with all this welfare warfare junk. And that's really the essence of America. I mean, that was our system for more than 100 years. And so, as you point out, when they talk about shutting it down, they're not talking about shutting it down like we're talking about, which we say would be a fantastic deal. They're leaving all these huge non-essential functions from a libertarian standpoint, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and other entitlements, the whole national security apparatus, killing people on a foreign basis, on a foreign level. I mean, they're constantly killing people in overseas lands. That was going to continue as one of the essential functions. And then, of course, there's the DEA and the drug enforcement, this massive catastrophe called the drug war. That wasn't going to stop. And so the whole thing was a sham. But they knew that the longer it goes, and the same thing's going to happen in 3 months or whenever this thing comes due again.
3 weeks.
3 weeks. They're not going to let it be shut down for long because people figure out, I mean, they haven't even gotten close to what we libertarians want, and nothing horrible is going to happen with a, quote, government shutdown. I should also mention that, many years ago, they really did shut down for a much longer time. I think it was like, 3 or 4 weeks or something. And they shipped home all the, quote, non-essential workers. Well, again, their definition of non-essential is different from the libertarian definition. But what was really funny was the aftermath of this, and nothing happened again. As you say, they try to put pain on the American people, like close the national parks so people will start screaming and stuff. But the word was that all the non-essential people had such emotional trauma from being labeled as non-essential that they decided not to use that term anymore because these people apparently had to go into therapy and stuff. And then when they returned, they gave them back pay. I mean, so
Yes.
like the shutdown didn't accomplish anything. So yes, it's a big sham. But Richard, at least it enables us libertarians to keep raising people's vision. to the question that you mentioned. What should be the role of government in a free society? Do we want mandatory charity? Do we need mandatory charity? What would happen if we did push a button and all the mandatory charity programs from Social Security and Medicare on down were suddenly dismantled? The income tax dismantled. The whole national security state Cold War apparatus dismantled, leaving in right there in place a limited federal government with very few powers. That, to me, is the essence of a free society, and that's what we libertarians have to keep, pounding away on. That this is the ideal: a shutdown, a permanent shutdown of all of the genuinely non-essential functions of the federal government.
Yes, in fact, in the piece that I posted on this on our FFF website on Monday, said at one point that in spite of the smoke and mirrors of a shutdown that's not a shutdown, it should be viewed by us as the opportunity for, as the phrase goes, a teachable moment to ask ourselves and our fellow citizens, well, if government was not to do X, not to do Y, not to do Z, in a real sense, other than this illusionary game they play, would it be so bad? What is the function and role of government? Would the world end, as you're suggesting, if government wasn't doing redistributive program X, Y, and Z, or regulatory policies A, B, and C, or foreign interventions of various types? Would the world end? Now, in fact, very interesting. I was just looking today among the Rasmussen polls. What did the shutdown mean, or what would it have meant if it had gone on to the average person who's polled in these things? And they said that, well, from the media, there's this impression that if the shutdown, quote, the shutdown had gone on, it might have had an impact on the economy or the society as a whole. But the additional part of the question was, but what would this shutdown have meant for you? That is, would it have impacted you? And the large majority of the people said, no, if the shutdown had gone on, I just would have gone on my normal business. The fact is, you go to work in a private business, you go shopping in the private stores, you go to the grocery for your food, you go out to a restaurant for the evening or a movie theater for entertainment, you get together with friends and have a drink at a bar, let's say. The fact is, life goes on. There is the social arena of the private sector, both just personal interactions and families and friends and civil society associations, and the marketplace of the producing and the buying and selling of goods. And then there's government. And the fact is, if government, quote, went away, by which I mean that classical liberal notion that government only protects life, liberty, and property, all of these other things would not only go on, but the resources siphoned off by government that would be restored to our private hands as the producers of that wealth in society would enable us to do far more of those things which really go on uninterrupted, even if the government is not doing anything. So, in fact, it should be viewed as an opportunity for even more of what you do in your daily life that you enjoy, you consider valuable, necessary, part of the affairs of just living, would go on successfully and without the government burdening you with the wealth that's siphoned away that limits how much of those things you could do.
That is an absolutely fantastic point, because there was one article I read that said, if this thing goes on too long, it's going to really have an adverse effect on the economy. And what his analysis was is that there's this huge segment of society that depends on this federal largesse. Contractors, subcontractors, the people that buy from contractors and subcontractors. And so as you stop this sector from having this tax money, they're going to stop. They're not going to have the money to go and buy the things that they were going to buy. And so the argument was, well, see, this is going to really hurt the economy. I mean, an analogy, Richard, is like the Egyptian system, which is run totally by the military. They run the hotels. They run the whole country. They play this dominant role in the economy. And we libertarians would say, well, that's the root cause of your problems in Egypt, that you've got this dominant role that the military is playing. Now, why is that? Well, because that's the parasitic sector of society. It's not like just a regular business, which a lot of mainstream commentators think it is. Like it's just another player in the marketplace. It's not just another player. It doesn't produce wealth. It confiscates wealth from the private sector to fund this segment. Well, if we dismantle this segment, it's a doubly positive effect because now people get to keep the money that was ordinarily being taken from them to fund this public sector. And then you've got all these people in the public sector who are non-productive that are suddenly in the private sector producing wealth. So it's a doubly positive effect. You've doubled the producers or multiplied the producers, and you haven't taken money away from the original producers. So, but yeah, it's easy for them to point to this public sector and say, oh, look at the damage that Northern Virginia is going to suffer because federal largesse is not being spent as much as it was before during the shutdown. But the flip side of this is that if you dismantle all this, sure, those in the federal sector are impacted, but overall society and especially the taxpayers are the ones that tremendously benefit from a shutdown.
Yeah, I think that another teachable moment by this very point that the critics make, that is the critics of who fear a shutdown, is this very issue. Oh, you mean government has siphoned off so much wealth from the productive private sector that if the recipients of this siphoned off wealth do not have it to spend, so many people be harmed because of their dependency on the spending of those dollars by bureaucrats and politicians and their staffs. And the fact is, for places like Washington, D.C., or retail stores in Northern Virginia, for instance, that's probably the case. But that just demonstrates the extent to which wealth has been taken, and these people have it to spend. The analogy that I would also make is think of the guy who runs an extortion racket, protection racket, and he siphons off wealth from people by threatening their lives and their property if they don't pay. Okay, and let's suppose that these thugs, they want to create a good impression among the other members of the community in which they do that, and so they take part of the money that they have extorted under the threat of violence to innocent people, and they spend it in the community. The lead thug who charitably gives money to build like some basketball courts for the young people in the community, or makes a point of always spending at local restaurants. So when he comes in, the restaurateur, he knows he's going to have a good evening because he brings his entourage and all the meals he's going to sell and the wine he's going to sell that night. And then someone comes along and says, this is a thug and a gangster. He's extorting money from people under the threat of violence and force. Let's stop him doing this. And then the gang says, but look at all the good I do in the community, and think of the restaurateur who's going to see his revenues fall and who's going to contribute, to the good deeds, like a basketball court for the disadvantaged kids in the neighborhood. I have to be allowed to continue to be an extortionist or a thug for the good of the people who receive part of my largesse when I spend it. See, it's the same logic.
Yeah, that's a great point. That it brings to mind the point that Frederick Bastiat, the famous French libertarian economist, legislator, and Henry Hazlitt, the free market Austrian economist, used to make about what is seen and what is not seen. Yeah. That it's easy for public officials in the mainstream press to say, look at that community center the government built, or look at all these jobs government has created. We can't afford to lose all that largesse because it's going to hurt the economy. Well, as Hazlitt and Bastiat point out, what is unseen is all the things that did not come into existence because people had their money taken from them to fund these government programs. If you leave the money in the private hands, they bring jobs, they bring opportunities for people because they're able to keep their own money and do what they want with it.
One of the historical examples of what we're talking about is that one of the concerns, as it was clear that the Allies were going to win the Second World War, that America would no longer be fighting, would be that when the military spending stopped and all the people who had either volunteered or the large number who had been conscripted to participate in the armed forces during the Second World War were now returned to the private sector, the economy would collapse. It'll fall back into the Great Depression of the 1930s. Think of all the jobs and the businesses dependent upon those government dollars. Now, the fact is that millions of people were let go from the military in a relatively short period of time after the end of the war in 1945. And all of that government spending obviously ended. They didn't need as many planes and tanks and uniforms and ammunition and food supplies that were going for military personnel through the conduit of government spending and so on. But a Great Recession didn't occur. Why? Because commensurate with the decline in government spending and the release of all those people from military government employment, if you will, was that the Truman administration, and even though Truman is not my favorite president, the Truman administration cut taxes. The spending was cut, the taxes were cut, which also, of course, reduced government deficit spending, the pressure on the private financial markets to have funds siphoned off for part of the war spending. And what happened when money was left in people's hands and resources and all of those potential private sector workers were released from their military servitude? You had this huge post-war boom.
Yeah.
People wanted homes. People wanted to buy cars. People wanted to finally overcome the rationing shortages that had limited their ability just to enjoy the basic amenities of everyday life. So if you cut this government spending, you had a shutdown, and all these people were sent home, and you didn't keep the dollars coming into the IRS, because you see, government national parks might be shut down, but the IRS personnel are still in their offices getting the tax dollars from employers with our withholding and business taxes. If the taxes are cut, the spending stops, the private sector blossoms in the imagery of that example of the immediate post-World War II period.
Absolutely. And it was what I was saying is that now you've taken all these soldiers who are non-productive, they're not producing well, they're in the private sector. That's not a burden on the private sector. They now become producers themselves.
Absolutely.
And the taxpayers get to keep their own money, which is capital, which is the key to rising standards of living. So it's by laying off this whole sector of parasitic part of government, there is a doubly positive effect, both for the taxpayer and for the economy with these producers, these non-producers that have now become producers. And another example of this, sort of related, indirect, was what happened in Germany, when they had this whole system after World War II of price controls that U.S. authorities had imposed on West Germany. And when Ludwig Erhard, the president of Germany or prime minister, said, look, I want to lift these price controls, they said, U.S. officials said, no, there will be chaos. You have to do this gradually. You can't just release these things because the entire sector of the economy is dependent on these controls. And one Sunday, Erhard just pushes the button and decrees that all the price controls are lifted. And that was really the origin of the German economic miracle, the revival of German economy. It wasn't the so-called Marshall Plan, which was just a welfare plan. It was really what Erhard was doing in terms of free market policies.
Yeah, I should mention, just as an addition, as sort of a footnote to that example of Germany beginning in 1948, Ludwig Erhard had been appointed by the British and Americans because it was still under occupation. There was not a new, West German government yet of a country, independent country, and he was the economic minister in charge of overseeing the occupation zones, and he did this on a Sunday. He just released all the controls, and the commander of all American forces in occupied Germany called him into his office, General Lucius Clay, and Lucius Clay said, "Listen, all of my economic advisors tell me that your lifting of these controls and regulations over private sector production is going to be a disaster." And Ludwig Erhard looked at him, and both of them recounted this in their separate memoirs. That Ludwig Erhard said to General Clay, "General Clay, don't worry. My advisors tell me the same thing." Well,
great.
That was the beginning of the economic miracle.
Right. That was the start of the German revival, the so-called free market. Okay, we've got just a little time left. Let's just address briefly, maybe we can revisit the issue of Trump's protectionism, and it's clearly a protectionist action. He's imposed tariffs on South Korea and China with respect to solar panels and washing machines. He's doing it to protect domestic producers from what they say is unfair competition, that China and South Korea are dumping lower priced items on the market. Give us your synopsis of what's going on here, Richard.
Well, first of all, let me say, before I do that, let me say sort of a weird irony in all this. One of the companies that Trump says needs protection in the solar panel business is, quote, an American company that is primarily owned by a Chinese company. So he has to protect a Chinese company in the United States from Chinese competition of companies in China. Duh. And it's actually doing very badly. But let's think about this. What is he doing? He's basically saying that the United States government is going to impose a tariff burden, a tax burden, on all American consumers of solar panels, of items such as washing machines, washing machines, precisely to supposedly protect these producers from what? The competition of others who are able to supply similar products at lower prices and possibly with better quality than the American competitor can match. This means that money is going to be taken out of American income earners' pockets because the goods will now cost more with the import tax put on top of what would be a market price. The variety available to American consumers will be reduced. And all of this will result in retaliatory actions. The Chinese government has already suggested that if this is implemented, they may institute counter tariffs against American goods. So then American exporters to China are going to see their products kept out of China. Their revenues will be reduced. Their employees may not see salary increases, or some of them may be let go. All of this is a game in which Trump has decided who's going to be winners and losers, interfering with the free flow of goods and services that benefit everyone. Now, sometimes, particularly with the Chinese, it is said, but don't they subsidize some of their exports to the United States that is below what would be hypothetically a market cost-based price? That might be true, but so what? In that sense, it's American consumers getting a discounted price for goods that would even cost more from the foreign producer. By costing less, money is left over in his pocket. The example I like to use, Jacob, if I can put it this way, imagine that a domestic producer is offering you a product for $10, and the foreign supplier is willing or able, either from his own cost efficiency or a subsidy from his government, to offer you that product for $5. You now have the product you want, and you have $5 left in your pocket to spend on things that previously you didn't have that money available to use because it was tied up in spending $10 for the product in question. You now have a rising standard of living. You have the product you want, and you can now buy other things that previously had been beyond your financial reach. At the same time, those dollars are earned by the foreign seller. Now, assuming he doesn't want to use dollars as wallpaper, the seller will want to use those dollars to buy American goods. And that will create alternative jobs and employment, as well as the jobs and employments that can be created because now the American consumer has a higher standard of living to demand other things that previously were not available to him. Now, who should be complaining if this is a product imported into the United States because of a cost advantage due to a subsidy that foreign government is giving to that foreign supplier? It should be the taxpayers of that foreign country. They're the ones who are being taxed to give a subsidy to a government in their country to give Americans a free goodie. So this is a totally perverted way of resulting in burdening American consumers to help a very narrow segment of special interest producers in America that have the ear of Trump. Now, I don't want to just poke on Trump, though of course he often needs poking with these issues. Obama did this. George W. Bush did this. Bill Clinton did this. George Bush Sr. did this. I know it's shocking. Ronald Reagan did this. You can go on and on and on. This has been the policy for a long time, that the government picks winners and chooses losers by putting itself in the method of using the tax structure, not merely to collect taxes in a classical liberal sense of low taxes to just have enough to, to protect life, liberty, and property. They use the tax structure as a way of introducing differential interventions to benefit some at the expense of others. It is a tool of manipulation and control to benefit some at the expense of others. And this will be a disaster and a burden and a political perversion, just as it has been with every previous administration.
Yeah, the example I like to use is that suppose Toyota suddenly announced that they were going to give a free Toyota Camry to every family in America. They're going to ship it over and just going to donate to it. And let's even go further and assume that the Japanese taxpayers have subsidized this free gift. Well, I got a feeling that 99% of American families would say, great, bring it on, ship it to me. Very few families would say, well, no, I think I'm going to reject it because the Japanese taxpayers are subsidizing this Camry. Well, if the Japanese government wants to give these free Camrys away, it's the right of the American people to accept this gift. The federal government has no authority to say, well, no, this is going to adversely impact the sales of Ford and General Motors, because if everybody gets a free Camry, they won't go buy a Ford or General Motors or be less likely to buy a car. Well, that's not a legitimate exercise of power. People have a right to accept these gifts without being punished by the government for doing so, or have the government take steps to protect American producers so that Americans will be forced to buy a car for them. And I mean, even if they impose a tariff of, let's say, $15,000 on the Camry, sure, it's still a good deal. You're getting a $30,000 car for $15,000, but it's an illegitimate exercise of power. People, the American consumers, have the right to accept these gifts, and the same principle applies to subsidized products. That if people want to dump their products at lower prices, nobody's guaranteed a right to be free from that type of competition. You enter the business world, you better be prepared that your competitors are going to be selling products, competing products at lower prices. If you don't want to play that competitive game, then don't enter that type of business. So, to me, Richard, it's a moral thing that this is the right of freedom to buy and sell and accept gifts and subsidized products, whatever, without the interference of your government. And one final thing here is notice where the money goes. When they impose these tariffs, the money goes into the coffers of the federal government.
Yes.
So it's a double racket. They're
Yes.
protecting the potential voters here in terms of domestic producers or donors to their campaigns, but then they're enriching their own little federal coffers with the money.
Absolutely. There's also the other element to this. If any American citizen or coalition of American citizens believe that this is an undue advantage being given to a foreign supplier due to a subsidy, let's say, that he thinks is unfair to the American competitor, all that single or multitude or coalition of American consumers have a recourse. And what is it? It's called a boycott. Now, there have been instances in American history when an appeal has been made that because of the behavior, the conduct, the actions of some seller or group of sellers to sort of express their disapproval, you will boycott purchasing their good. And sometimes these boycotts have been successful in bringing about a change in the policy of the person who is being boycotted. Any American consumer or coalition of American consumers who believe that an American supplier of washing machines is being unfairly competed against because of a foreign government subsidy has a choice. Don't buy the foreign version of the washing machine. Buy the American version and put your own money where your mouth is by paying the higher priced American version. You will have given him revenues, you will have saved his workers jobs, but you leave it up to the individual to make these choices without imposing your preferences upon others. which surely is a primary violation of any notion of freedom of choice and freedom of association.
That's a great point, and it happens. I mean, I've seen people that buy only General Motors because they don't want to buy Japanese. Fine, that's your choice. You want to pay a higher price, or they'll do it even if they think the Japanese quality is higher. They say, no, I'm an American and I'm going to buy American. Great, leave the government out of it. I think I'd be remiss, though, Richard. I know we're about out of time, but I think we ought to mention Bill Law, who really played a big role in our intellectual development, both of our intellectual developments. And he was one of the speakers at FEAST seminars, the Foundation for Economic Education, in the late 70s when you and I were attending those seminars. And he was the president of Cudahy Tanning Company in Cudahy, Wisconsin. The man was one of the best lecturers on libertarianism and free trade that I've ever seen. I even had him for a speak at a seminar in Laredo, my hometown of Laredo, Texas, and he was running this tanning company, leather company, that was just losing market share enormously to Japanese leather producers, and through it all, Law stood steadfast against tariffs on imported Japanese goods. He says, if we can't compete, then we go out of business. But do not protect us with competition. And he was able to stay in business, but that was one of the most heroic principle stands that I've ever seen a businessman take.
Well, I'll just reinforce that, if I may take a minute or two, is that I found out about Bill Law the first time because when I was very young, he wrote a piece making that case on the opinion page of the Wall Street Journal. He said that the tanning industry, the textile industry in the U.S., is being hurt by our foreign competitors. They're underselling us and capturing more of our market share. Many in my sector of the economy wish the government to impose a tariff to keep our rivals' products out or make them more expensive. I do not support my associates in the tanning industry and the textile industry. I would rather go under rather than stay in business at the immoral expense of taxpayers forced to pay a higher price for my product than the market would be providing them due to a government intervention. Now, I didn't know Bill Law. I don't even know how well I knew about the Foundation for Economic Education at that time. But all I know is that I read that editorial. That must have been in the late 60s, so I was a teenager still. And that just pointed out to me, it hit me. I was already familiar with the writings of Ayn Rand and the idea of, a principled position on individual liberty and laissez-faire. But here was a businessman who I knew nothing about, who said, I stand so much on the principle of freedom that I would rather run the risk of not being able to keep my niche in the division of labor than to be protected by inappropriate and immoral government intervention. That was and is the position of principle that I wish more private enterprises would both espouse and practice in our society.
Yeah, I think you'll remember that when we first were getting into libertarianism, at least I was in the 70s, I think you had discovered it long before I did. But there was this group that absolutely astounded me called the, I think, Competitive Enterprise, what was it? Council for Competitive Economy.
Yes.
Which was composed of libertarian businessmen who argued for free trade and no regulation, argued for free enterprise on a very principled libertarian basis. I mean, these were the no compromisers among the business community. They were business people and high-level business people, and the qualification for being a member was you had to maintain this principled stand, and Bill Law was one of them. And I remember they had this newsletter where they give out raspberries and roses to businesses that would either do good things in terms of freedom or bad things. And I remember when I saw that group, I was so impressed, because you just don't see that today in terms of businessmen taking this principled, no compromise approach to free trade and libertarianism. So that was a big group in my intellectual development.
Yeah, that's the ideal. That should be the benchmark of those who are in business and have any appreciation institutionally and in the practical affairs of everyday life of the importance of the principle of free enterprise and free trade, and practicing what you often preach but don't always follow through with.
Yeah, so I would recommend everybody to Google Bill Law, William L. Law, and
Yes.
read whatever articles you can find by Law. He was absolutely great. Richard,
In
greatly.
fact, yeah, I would just mention that if there is a way to find Bill Law's opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal from that time, and if there was not a big expense to get a reprint approval, that would be great to put up on the FFF website.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I'll take a look, see if we can find it. Hey, greatly enjoyed the show, Richard, as always, and look forward to talking to you next week. And thanks, everybody, for tuning in. Thanks for your comments, and we look forward to seeing you all next week. Richard, see you next week.
Until next time.
Okay.